Good morning, Covenant City Church. If you have your Bibles, please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 and 8, and then verses 25 through 40. Again, if you could draw your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, and then verses 25 through 40. We will continue our sermon series called Marks of a Faithful Church. And this morning we'll be centering and focusing upon singleness. And really the biblical motivation for singleness. And I know last week we talked about sexual intimacy and how sexual intimacy is meant to, by God's design, is meant to be practiced and engaged in the covenant union of marriage. That intimacy is a picture that is to push us forward into seeing the intimacy and the fellowship and the communion that we have with the covenantal Lord Himself. But even in saying that, the Apostle Paul is laying before us the grounds, and actually he's calling us to be assured that singleness has a purpose, it has an aim. That as much as marriage has an aim and a purpose and an intended goal, that singleness does as well. And so what we've tried to communicate is that singleness and marriage is not a zero-sum game. It is not a size that you pick. Are you for marriage or are you for singleness? But rather, in God's design, there is purpose for both. There is purpose for both. So really the crux of the argument that we see, and as we dive into chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, is really tied to verse 1 of chapter 7. So if you can look with me very quickly. Notice what Paul says here. He says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." So we see that the church of Corinth is really dealing with sexual ethics. What is the Christian sexual ethics, and how are we to respond to that now that we have been saved into Christ? Now this is important because Corinth is in the midst of an over-sexualized culture. The Greco-Roman world is over-sexualized, and they pervert that sexuality. And so as they interact and exchange with Paul through this dialogue, they want to make sure that, yes, they engage in sex, but in a proper way. What we've seen is in that chapter 5 is that Paul is guarding them against sexual immorality. And he calls them to engage in church discipline with those who are so-called Christians who profess faith in Christ, but are engaging in sexual immorality. But yet as he jumps into chapter 7, and the question is asked, is it good, or it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, he begins to deal with the other end of the spectrum, with those who want to engage with celibacy. And so they're engaging with this Jewish euphemism. But yet the interesting thing is this, is that Paul is necessarily not against this Jewish euphemism. He is actually for sex or singleness, but rather he tempers that. And he says, we must, though, be careful, yes, to pursue singleness, but we must be careful of the sexual drives and the temptation that the world gives. And so therefore, Paul in chapter 7 engages in the complexities that the church of Corinth finds themselves. Meaning that everybody's situation is not always so black and white. That there is this organic flow into the life of the church. And so Paul wants to use the biblical principles, yes, but he wants to apply those biblical gospel principles to every situation that the church, in its complexities and in its organic construction, so that they would know how to walk faithfully in light of the gospel. So this where it turns us then to singleness. How are we to gauge singleness? And I think it's important for our day and age because singleness is such a hot topic for us. It's such a topic that at times many of our singles within the church deem and feel it that as though that the church has neglected this topic, that has neglected them. And they are the ones that have been hidden from the church itself. But I want us to look at that, yes, there is a truth to that argument, But there's also another nuance that we need to think through and process as we think about singleness. But before we get to that, look at some of the statistics that I looked up in the Institute for Family Studies. And we see the trends and the fads and the patterns of this culture and of this society as we're moving away from marriage. So as much as we want to celebrate and champion singleness from a biblical and gospel standpoint, I think we need to be careful too how we frame this conversation. Now, in the 1970s, those who were around 25 years of age, male and female, they would say that males, 75% of those who are 25, would have been married already in the 1970s. In contrast to women at that time who would be 85% would have already been married. So we see that a large portion of the American society had already dove into and engaged in marital relationships. We see, though, in the 1920s that has shifted largely. In the 1920s, 25-year-old males, only 18% at its lowest, only 18% are married. In contrast to females, 25% of females who are 25 would be married. Some would say that when we get to 2050, that though that decline will be kind of find itself in a better posture, that we are, in some sense, in a tough position. Look at what the Institute of Family Studies says in this regards to 2050, how they're trying to project the trajectory of marriage. They say this, that the decline in marriage at age 25 may now be subsiding, but the effects of past delays will continue into older ages. This means that plausibly 1/3 of men and women who turn 45 in 2050, those who are about 18 or 19 today, will not have married by the time they turn 45. And so yes, we want to champion singleness, but we need to be careful what we are championing. We must be careful that we're not allowing the culture to dictate or define singleness, but rather we need to allow the biblical scriptures, God's word itself, to define and dictate and create the metrics to which we engage in singleness. Because if we don't, we're going to end up as the church beginning to champion something that is sub-biblical. Again, Covenant City Church, if we're not careful in assessing all these things, all these sociological studies through a biblical worldview, through a gospel lens, then we're going to begin to champion something that is sub-biblical. That's why it's not as though we don't want to encourage and build and nurture singles that are in the church, but we have to ask the question, why are you single? And why do you continue to perpetuate this lifestyle? Is it for the gospel? Or is it that you have bought into the cultural narrative of this day? So those are two really different things, and we need to be careful of those things. And so what I want to fight against today, I want to fight for biblical singleness. But I also want to fight against cultural singleness, secular singleness, pagan singleness. Because many times those of us young adults who are single, you're not necessarily pursuing singleness for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of the church. But what we hear is that it's really for the sake of, I want to travel. I want to see places. I don't want to get tied down with a ball and chain, so I want to travel. Or rather, I want to pursue my career advancement. I want to climb the corporate ladder. And so marriage and children will be a ball and chain in me pursuing those realities. Or thirdly, I want to pursue leisure and freedom. Before I get tied down, that's the language we use. Before I get tied down, I want to have fun. I want to enjoy my 20s. So I don't want to get married. Or fourthly, I want to focus on me. Right, before I have a family, I have to focus on them. I want to focus on me. And so that tends to be the cultural narrative of our singleness. And if that's true, if that evaluation is true, then I don't think we want to champion that. I don't think the Scriptures are calling us to champion that type of singleness. So then the question is this: what is the type of singleness that the Scriptures are calling us to? What is the type of singleness that Scripture is calling us to? And that is what we're going to dive into this morning. So if you're following along, the theological focus this morning will center upon biblical motivations for singleness. The theological focus this morning will center upon biblical motivations for singleness. Or put in question form, what are the essential markers for biblical singleness? What is its fundamental aim? And we're going to look at it in 3 stages. The first is we're going to look at the Apostle Paul's concession given to the church of Corinth. What is the principle that he is laying down for us? And how does that principle shape and inform and educate us in how we are to have a biblical worldview in engaging in these matters? And then secondly, we're going to look at the context. Why? Why does Paul give us this charge? Not a command per se, but a concession. But why? Why does Paul give us this concession? What is his motivation? And then thirdly, we're going to look at how Paul affirms not only singleness, but he affirms marriage at the same time, showing us that he is not opposed to one or the other, but that both have their place in the aim of the gospel. So let's look first to the concession of the apostle, Paul's concession. And we find this in verse 6 of chapter 7. So look with me at verse 6. He says this now. Now as a concession and not a command, I say this. So Paul is clear. This is not a commandment. This is not something to necessarily bind us, but it is a concession. The English translation is a concession, coming from the Greek term synagomi. Synagomi. But yet the word concession is actually too weak of a word. It doesn't capture what the Greek term is trying to say. Because concession is really just something that you can do or you cannot do. You can take it or you can throw it away type of deal. That's what concession means. And yet Paul is saying more than that. But he's not saying that it is command. Again, that is binding. So it's in between command and concession. But what does this Greek term actually mean? It means this: to think the same thing as someone, to have a joint opinion. Okay? Still an opinion, but in a joint opinion, a common mind or understanding. So what is Paul saying when he says, I have this concession? He is actually inviting us to have the same mind as Paul has. It's not a command, but he's actually saying strongly, he's urging us, think as I think. It's not just an opinion that you can just throw away, but it would be wise, it would be good for you to think as I think on this matter. So that is the concession that Paul is laying out for the church of Corinth and ultimately for us as well. And yet, why can Paul say this? Why can Paul give us this concession even though Jesus himself hasn't given us a command or hasn't talked upon this particular topic that we look at here? But look at verse 25. Look at why Paul can say what he says. Verse 25, he says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord. So it goes again. He reiterates his point. He's making a point. This is not a command. But yet, how can he still give us this concession? Or in your ESV, it says, this is my judgment. Now notice, judgment and concession have the same root word. So he's still on this point. I give you this concession. But why? Why can Paul give us this concession? But I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Paul is trustworthy to give this concession, to give this judgment, to give this opinion to them. Paul is not just this Joe Smo coming off the street, but Paul is an apostle, a mouthpiece of Christ Jesus himself. And we see this in 1 Corinthians 1:1, where Paul says, Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ. Not just a messenger, but a messenger of Christ. Then he goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 to 2. In this chapter, remember, Paul is arguing for his apostolic ministry. And so, what is or who are these apostles of Christ? Paul says it here. He says, this is how one should regard us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. So Paul's duty and job is to be a steward of the mysteries of God. That is the gospel of God himself. So Paul comes with this concession, calling us to think as he thinks, to understand as he understands, and this will be for our good. But now as we laid that reality and that truth as we think about singleness, the question is this: why? Why does Paul want us to think his thoughts after him? Why does Paul want us, as he is a messenger of Christ, a spokesman for Jesus, the Messiah, the Lord himself, why does Paul want us to think his thoughts after him? This leads us then to the next layer of our conversation, and it is understanding the context. Understanding the scenario, understanding the situation to which the church of Corinth is in, and to understand our own situation in order for us to better grasp the concession that Paul has for us. Look at verse 26. Look at the motivation for why Paul pushes us this way. He says this, verse 26, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. In view of the present distress. So as a reader, you should ask the question, what is the distress? What is the context? What is the situation to which Paul finds the church of Corinth that they should refrain from marriage and begin to think rightly about a life of singleness? Now, there are many different interpretations, many different ways in which scholars look at this point of distress. And even though there are three distinct, or will be three distinct ways in which we can look at this distress, I also want to say that they are not mutually exclusive. Meaning, you don't have to just pick one, but they are all under a stronger or wider umbrella as it is. But let me break it down for us, and then I'll make sense of it for us. Many scholars look at the church of Corinth at that day dealing with a distress. And that distress could be interpreted as a famine that the church of Corinth was in. And that famine brought really a hard time of life in a way of living for the church of Corinth. Similar to maybe economical struggles that we face in this day and age. So because there are economical struggles, some probably pragmatically could say, maybe you need to refrain from marriage because it's just we have a famine and we can't find food and we can't make a living for one another. So it would be wiser for us, practically speaking, to refrain. So some scholars would argue from that vein. Others would argue, secondly, because there is great persecution for the church. The church is dealing with great persecution even unto death. So therefore, we should refrain from marriage, a marriage that may hinder us and hurt us because of that harsh and strict persecution. And then thirdly, there are scholars who would argue that it is an eschatological argument, meaning that Paul is not necessarily arguing pragmatically, though there is pragmatic implications, but what Paul is arguing is it is more theological. Paul is saying that we are in the last days. We are in the last days, so let us steward our time. Let us steward our time well and be wise about how we engage in life for the sake of the kingdom, for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the advancement of the kingdom. Now again, all those three things are not mutually exclusive, meaning that we don't have to sever them and they can't blend into each other. Because famine and persecution are signs of the end times, actually. So I would argue that the distress is eschatological, theological, but that theological implication is that there is persecution. So we see this. We see this in Luke chapter 21, verse 23, when Jesus speaks about the days that are to come. Look what he says. He says, "Alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people." So even before Jesus ascends back up into the right hand of the Father, he warns the church that there will be days of persecution. And that those who are nursing, those women who are pregnant, woe to you. It would be hard days for you in that day of persecution. So what we see here historically with the Church of Corinth is this, is that a decade after Paul writes to the Church of Corinth, we see great persecution fall upon the church through Nero. And Christians are murdered and killed under his reign. And so this is really the mindset. This is the stress that Paul has. But what about for us today? This is the context. This is the situation that the Church of Corinth is in. But what about for us in this day and age? Covenant City Church, as one pastor, John Piper, would say, we are not in peacetime, but we are in wartime. In wartime, it's very harsh and difficult. In American history, we see this in World War I and World War II, when the men were sent out into war, into battle. Women had to step into the factory workers, step into the industry so that they could build bombs and weaponry to send to wartime. Even though it was not right for women to work in that way, to labor that hard, because it is wartime, because we are in extreme circumstances, we must take extreme measures. In that same sense, that's what Paul is calling us. So your singleness isn't just for the sake of travel, of enjoyment, of leisure, but it is understanding that we are in wartime. And would it be more strategic with my life to be poured out, as Paul would say, because Paul never married. Paul was single himself. And Paul says time and time again to Timothy, I am being poured out like a drink offering. But what does that mean, to be poured out like a drink offering? That his life is a living sacrifice given to the covenantal Lord himself. So, singleness in a biblical metric, in the biblical standard, is not for your own gain or your own leisure, but it is to have a wartime mentality and to say, I'm not married yet, so therefore let me dedicate my time, let me dedicate my efforts, my strength, my talents, my giftings for the sake and advancement of the gospel. This is the aim of Paul. So Paul is calling us to have a heavenly mindset, to have a heavenly gaze. Look what he says in verse 29 and 31. This further substantiates his claim for us to have a Godward gaze at our singleness. Look at verse 29. It says, this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time, again, we see that again. Appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. That is the motivation, and also, too, that is the mindset that Paul is calling us to, singles. Now, the question is this: what is the purpose of this saying that Paul has here? It seems as though Paul is saying, for those who are married, act like you're not married. So is he calling us then to not engage in our responsibilities? That seems then, if that's what he's saying, if that's how we're interpreting it, then the scriptures are contradicting themselves. Because in Ephesians, he's calling husbands to love your wives as Christ loved the church. But now here he's saying, you know what? Act like you're not married. What is he saying? No, he's not saying that we shouldn't take responsibility. What Paul is saying is that our mindset is that we should not terminate on worldly things. Our mindset should be heavenly, should be kingdom-oriented. We should live in such a way. My wife and I, your wife and yourself, should live in such a way. Not that we're not responsible for one another, engaging in with one another, but engage in such a way as we're kingdom-oriented. I'm not buying, as Paul would say here, I'm not buying goods like the world buys goods. I'm not buying the $1 million home because the world is building the $1 million home. I'm not engaged in the American dream with all the cars and the luxuries and the toys. Like what our old Hmong people are saying, that I want you to have just like everybody else has. They have cars and trucks. They have toys and trinkets. Then I want you to have toys and trinkets. That's not the mindset of the kingdom. The mindset of the kingdom will be, I will steward my funds for the sake of the kingdom. I will steward my time, I will steward my giftings for the sake of the kingdom. That is the mindset that Paul is calling us to. And singles, that is the mindset that Paul is calling you to. Not to waste your singleness. Even if this singleness is just for a mere season and you will engage in marriage. Not to waste it on just selfish gain. Look what the scriptures go on to say for us to further substantiate this point. Look what the Apostle John says in 1 John 2:15 and 17. He says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Verse 17. And the world is passing away along with its desires. The world is passing away. These things will not remain. The kingdom is going to come, and there is eternity to which we have to enjoy. So have eternity in mind. Look what Romans 8:18-23 says. It sets us toward this eschatological end. It sets us toward this heaven gaze. Look what Paul says. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time, all of the giving up of the American dream, all of the giving up of the trinkets and toys, all the giving up of the leisure for the sake of the gospel, I consider it nothing compared to the glory. That the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to fertility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. So even Paul is reminding us that we're longing for more. We're longing for eternity. That's why creation, that's why earth, the world, cannot satisfy us. Because we're longing for eternity. There is something in us that is longing for eternity. So therefore, live for eternity. And then 1 Thessalonians 14, 13b and 14 says this: that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with Him those who have fallen asleep. You see, Paul in verse 30 of chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians says, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning. Yes, there is much lost. There's much loss in this life and in this world. We've lost loved ones. We've lost relationships, and we've lost marriages. We've lost friends. And we mourn those. So don't hear me say that we should not mourn those. But we do not, as Paul says to the church of Thessalonica, we do not grieve as though we do not have hope. Even though we've lost loved ones, fathers, husbands, wives, children, even though we have lost children in the womb, we do not mourn as though we do not have hope. But we mourn with the fact that there is eternity, to be enjoyed. Paul is setting the mindset of those who will engage in singleness, not on the thrills of what this world can give, but he's setting our minds on eternity. Again, he further substantiates this claim in verses 32 to 35. Look at how he talks about the anxieties of life. Verse 32. I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. And his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraints upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Your undivided devotion to the Lord. Your undivided devotion to the Lord. Notice how Paul marks, he sets the standard for singleness. Your undivided devotion to the Lord. Singles, you have a great gift before you. You have time and energy at your disposal to use it for the sake of the kingdom. What a beautiful thing. So it is not right for you to feel as though you are a second-class citizen. And I pray that you do not feel that way here at Covenant City Church, that you are a second-class citizen because you are not married. But rather you have a unique responsibility in this season of life to engage the kingdom and the church in a way that we as married couples, we as those who have children cannot. I remember as a young man, growing in my fervor for the Lord, growing in my zeal for the gospel, could dedicate endless times with the youth, endless times mentoring and guiding, endless times coaching, because I was not restrained by anything, but just my dedication to God's people. What a beautiful season. And not saying that those seasons are better than my season now when I have 4 children that I can dedicate to. I'm not saying that my children are a ball and chain in those sense. But my commitment is divided. In a good sense, but it's divided. But you as singles, what a gracious, what a glorious season of life to engage in. And so engage in them well for the sake of the gospel. So this leads us then to the third and final point. Paul affirming Not only marriage, but singleness. And again, showing us that it is not a zero-sum game. But each institution, whether it be marriage or singleness, has its purpose and its aim. And so engage those things for the sake of the gospel. Look at verse 36 through 40a. He says this: if anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, meaning his sexual desires, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let him marry. It is no sin. It is good. Verse 37. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desires under control, and has determined in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes. So what Paul is laying for us is that, again, it is good if you marry. And if you don't marry, it is good. But he also reminds us, but if you do marry, you're covenantally bound. So don't forsake that marriage. But if your husband dies, then you are free to marry again. But notice here, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. Now again, last week we talked about what are the scenarios to be married to an unbeliever. Remember, the church of Corinth found themselves in a situation, in a predicament that they were being converted into the church. And so maybe one spouse was converted before the other. And so it ends up that they are married to unbelievers. And what Paul is saying here is this, is that stay with them. Remember, that was the argument. Stay with them if they allow you to stay with them. But if they die and you get a chance to remarry, the principle and the command is this: you must marry in the Lord. So singles who are in a season of singleness, but yet still desire marriage, it is appropriate for us to date and to marry Christians. And it is unbecoming of us. Hear me say this. It is unbecoming of us to date and to marry unbelievers. To be evenly yoked with, to be tied to an unbeliever who does not have our fundamental worldview, who does not have a fundamental belief systems. So singles, hear us. We will shepherd you accordingly to what the Scriptures teach. So if you engage with an unbeliever in the pursuit of marriage, we will shepherd you accordingly. We will say you need to refrain, you need to draw back, and that is not to steal joy from you, young people. It is to give you joy. It is to invite you into joy. So young people, when we say as pastors, when we say as member-to-member accountability, when we say, oh, it's not wise, it's not good for you to date an unbeliever, it is not anything necessarily against the unbeliever per se, as though we don't love them and want them to come to faith and we don't want to minister to them. It is for our love for you, because the Scriptures have called us to a different way of living. But what we see here, Paul gives to us, is an affirmation of marriage and an affirmation of singleness. Now again, the question is begged to be asked. What does singleness have to do with marks of a faithful church? How does this sermon perpetuate and push forward the notion of having marks or being a faithful church? And I want to reiterate again, strong families build strong churches, and strong churches build strong families, all of which is for the glory and mission of Christ. Singleness, strong emphasis upon biblical singleness will build strong churches, and strong churches will reinforce biblical singleness for the glory of Christ. So singles, 3 things for you to meditate on as we close out our sermon this morning. 3 things. Singles, devote yourself to Christ. You are in a season where you are free and not bound. Time is ample. Time is much. Energy is much. Devote yourself to Christ. Devote yourself to the study of the Word. Devote yourself to the establishment of strong biblical doctrine and theology. Devote yourself to loving Christ with your heart, but to loving Christ with your mind. In a wartime situation that we find ourselves, where there are ideologies that are floating around there that are sub-biblical and that are seeking to steal the joy of our children and our churchmen. Singles, study hard, love hard, devote yourself to Christ. Secondly, devote yourself to kingdom work. Devote yourself to the kingdom and devote yourself to kingdom work. Do not fancy yourself with things that will not last. One pastor said many years ago, and it still resonates. The pastor said, the fear is not failure. Failure is not the fear. Young people, failure in your life should not be feared. You will fail. Failure should not be feared. What you should fear is succeeding in things that don't matter. Failure should not be feared. What you should fear, though, young people, singles, what you should fear is succeeding in things that don't matter, that does not have an eternal weight to it. That's what you should fear. Give yourself to devote yourself to the kingdom and to its work. And then thirdly, devote yourself to the church and her mission. Singles, oh, we need you. We need you to live life alongside us, to sharpen us. We need you to be with us on mission for the sake of the gospel. This isn't a country club where married people come to just hang out and raise children together. This is a church that is to sharpen one another for the sake of the mission of the gospel. And so, singles, we need you. And we need you to be on board and on task with what you have been called to. To have a gospel-centered, gospel-saturated aim in your singleness. Just as much as we at Covenant City Church here call and charge our husbands and our wives to shepherd and to love well, we're going to call our singles to serve well as well. That the demand that the gospel gives unto us, regardless if we're married or we're single, is high. So therefore, the church and the pastors and the members are going to shepherd accordingly. Devote yourself to the church and her mission. What a beautiful mission that we have. What a beautiful message that we have to herald and proclaim. What a beautiful gospel that we have to live. Because, Covenant City Church, we have eternity. We have eternity to look forward to. Let us do this together. For the glory of Christ and for the good of our hearts. Let's pray.